And we're back one last time as we finish finally the novel When the Legends Die by Hal Borland. And we left off where Tom has finished up his duties as a rancher, working with the sheep and getting himself healed up. And he is all set to go back and try the rodeo circuit one more time. But then he sees the grizzly bear that came out of the woods and attacked and killed one of the sheep, one of the lambs. And seeing that grizzly and pursuing it made him remember all these long dead, long hidden memories of his childhood as Thomas Blackbull, as Bear Brother. And as a result, he is realizing if he wants to go on with his life as Tom Black, Killer Tom Black, he has to kill the bear because this bear represents everything in his past that he's been wanting to get rid of all this time. And so in order for him to get on with his life as Tom Black, he needs to kill everything that's representing Thomas Black Bull. That's the bear. And as we finish the book, we start off in chapter 47, page 196. He stayed at the old camp at the first night, but even with the sheep gone, the smell persisted. He had been so used to it all summer that he hadn't noticed, but now it seemed to taint the air. Sitting by the fire that evening, smelling the light breeze that came in over the old campground, he had the wry thought that a good many things were like the sheep. You got free of them, or you thought you did, but the smell kept coming back. Well, he told himself that's why he was here. He had to get rid of those memory smells, all but one, and had come back to get rid of it. He had put off his return to the arena for a week or two just to get it done, to wipe the slate clean. He was going to run that bear down. If even it was a grizzly, he was going to kill it. He drank a last cup of coffee, ignored the sheep smell, rolled up his blanket, and slept soundly. But the sheep smell was so strong in the damp air the next morning, so after a quick breakfast, he packed his gear and moved to a little meadow. He had seen a sheep spring there a few days ago, enough water for a one-man camp. He went there, slung his pack in a tree, safe from prowlers, and set out with only his belt knife and his rifle. He climbed the old trail through the tongue of brush, the little opening where he had seen the bear track, and began to range the mountainside. The trail was cold, and the mountainside was a maze of rocky ledges and talus slopes with a scattering of scrub oak and twisted pine. He climbed, he looked a half-mile further, and he found the remains of the lamb, 2 hooves, a scattering of splintered bones, several patches of skin that had been gnawed on by mice and pecked by magpies. He went on, circling, and in the early afternoon he found a big pine with claw marks. The gouges were high on the trunk, as high as he could reach, but that proved nothing. A rock that had been the foot of the tree had been rolled aside, probably for the bear to get the ants and grubs beneath it. The bear could have stood on the rock and put his claw marks on the tree before it heaved the rock aside. He completed his circle, came back to where he started. He hadn't found another sign, hadn't seen one clear track. It was late afternoon. He went on down to the sheep spring, made camp, and as he ate supper, he tried to figure it. If it had been a big cinnamon, it should have been left more signs. A cinnamon is just a black bear in a cinnamon color phase. All bears are wanderers, but the blacks and cinnamons keep to a smaller range than grizzlies, especially if they have a convenient source of food. An old grizzly will travel 10 miles overnight, stop for a light meal, and then go on another 10 miles or more. A cinnamon will eat, sleep, then go back to where it got its first meal. If it had been a cinnamon, Tom reasoned, it would come back for another lamb. At least it would have stayed around for a few days, hopeful. If it was a grizzly, it probably would travel till it made a big kill, such as a deer. Then it would eat, hide its kill, sleep, then gorge again before moving on. It didn't add up either way. Tom kept telling himself that he had seen a grizzly, but he'd only had 2 brief looks. First when the bear killed the lamb, then when it turned to threaten to charge him at the little clearing. He had been so excited he followed it into the brush unarmed. Could he believe his own eyes? He had found that one track, but could he have exaggerated its size? Woodward said and his men agreed that the last grizzly had been killed 4 years ago. Woodward could be wrong, of course. There might still be a grizzly around, a wise old bear that had outwitted them all, but the chances are that the cub Tom had known was less than 1 in 100. A grizzly cub doesn't reach full growth till it's 6 or 7 years old, and there'd be hazards all along the way, special hazards for a cub that had once been a pet. Some grizzlies live to be 30, maybe even more. But even if that cub lived to grow up, its chances of survival this long were slim, with persistent hunters and bear-hating ranchmen. All the odds said that the bear it saw kill a lamb was a big cinnamon. So what they're saying is, they're guessing is a chance that it's his brother, his pet. It says not likely. But he'd come back to run that bear down, identify it as possible, and put an end to that last nagging hurt. The hurt had only begun. He had finished his meal, cleaned his utensils, and slept. The next morning he went halfway up the mountainside, made a big circle, and late in the day, down the river not far from the forks, he found a patch of pines that had been taken down a few years ago by a rock slide. Poking around the triangle, he found where a bear had rolled two rotting logs aside to get at beetles that had dug out a den of marmots or chipmunks. It must have been a big bear to have moved those logs. It may have been there several days before then, and the tracks that had left were all smudged. He was up to West Fork a little way and found a rotten stump that had been ripped apart, more of the bear's work. But again, there was no recognizable tracks. By all the signs, the bear was going northwest, away from Horse Mountain, where he had left his gear. He was 2 hours from his camp, and as he worked his way wearily back up Horse Mountain, he decided that if he didn't want to spend half his time coming and going, he'd better move. Then he thought that if he was doing this the old way, he would forget about camp, just take his rifle and his knife and maybe a small packet of food, and stay with the trail till he caught up with the bear, sleeping wherever night found him. And he thought with a bitter laugh, sing the bear chant. That's why he had come back, he told himself, to be free of these things, to kill those memories, the last remnant of his past. The next morning he packed his gear and took it down to the forks, went up West Fork a little way, and set up a new camp beside the stream. That afternoon he worked up the creek and found where the bear had dug camas roots, in a grassy opening. It had ripped up quite an area, flinging big chunks of sod aside, tearing them apart to get at the quamash in them. It had been only 2 days ago, 3 at most. He spent 2 more days working the lower end of West Fork, but all he found was another place upstream where the bear had dug quamash. The second afternoon, a chill wind blew up and the sky clouded over, and when the rains began that evening, he remembered several signs of bad weather coming that he had ignored. The rain was cold, probably was falling to snow on the peaks. From looks of things, could continue all night, perhaps for several days. He got soaked finding dry wood before he'd eaten his supper. The drainage from the slope began to seep through the camp. The place he had picked was all right in dry weather, but was miserable in the rain. He moved up the hillside to the partial shelter of a clump of spruces, rigged an inadequate roof with a small tarp, and finally got a new fire going in front of it, and rolled up in his damp blanket. He spent a cold, uncomfortable night. He waked to a gray, chill, rainy day and got soaked looking for a standing dead tree with dry wood. With the fire going at last, he cooked breakfast and tried to dry his blanket, but the gusty wind whipped the fire and blew rain in his shelter. He spent a miserable day feeding the fire and trying to dry his gear, and trying to make sense of what he was doing. He had been a week on his bear hunt. As far as he could see, he was no closer to the bear than when he had started. Why, if it was a cinnamon, didn't it stop in one place? Then why, if it was a grizzly, did it either move out or make a big kill? There were deer around. He hadn't seen a deer, but he hadn't been looking for one. There were tracks. Thinking of deer, Tom was hungry for venison. For a week he had been living on pancakes, bacon, and trout, and his bacon was almost gone. Thinking of the soggy, half-cooked pancakes he had eaten yet today, his mouth watered at the very thought of venison. He told himself he would take a deer tomorrow if it stopped raining, butcher out a loin, and live high for a few days he would be here. One loin, that's all he needed. There's something deep inside said it wasn't right to waste meat. It wasn't even right to take meat unless you needed it. Waste meat, and what you take to use will soon begin to stink. He shook his head angrily at the thought. Superstitions. Who was he anyway, a clout Indian? He felt the chill of the water trickling under him and moved to a drier place and put more wood on the fire. Wet wood that smoldered and smoked. No, he decided wryly, he wasn't a clout Indian, or he'd have picked a better campsite where he had the chance. And he'd see to it he had plenty of dry wood, and watch the weather signs, instead of squatting on a creek bank with bad weather coming like a fool on his first camping trip. All right, he made a mistake. Another mistake. His first mistake was coming back here instead of going to Albuquerque. Why had he come back anyway? Because he saw a bear that he thought was a grizzly and got the idea that he had to kill it. Why? Because he's Killer Tom Black and he wanted to forget he was an Indian. That's why. He laughed at that, a snorting laugh of derision. Killer Tom Black, the Indian who was the devil killer, was just newspaper stuff, publicity. All right, so he killed a horse or two. And so he had a grudge, a lot of gravel in his craw, as Dr. Ferguson put it. He took it out in the Bronx. He made a reputation and lived up to it, gave the crowds what they wanted. But that was all over now, over and past. He had gotten that out of his system. Now he's going back and writing for points, for money, and wind up his career in a few more seasons with a record they'll be shooting for a long time to come. He felt the rain trickling under him again, and the smoke in his eyes, and he reminded himself that he wasn't in the arena or anywhere near it. He was right here in this miserable camp, waiting for the cold rain to let up so he could go looking for that bear again. The whole thing seemed very stupid. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like a fool. He had lived with everything that bear represented for a long time. He could go on living with it, he decided. As soon as the rain stopped, he would dry his gear, pack up, and get out of there. With that thought, a decision made, he felt more at ease. He built up the fire again, found a dry spot to sit, and dozed in the warmth. When he awakened in the mid-afternoon, the rain had begun to slacken. Another hour had eased to a drizzle, and the sky began to clear. He needed more wood. He picked up his axe and started to leave the shelter, and his eye was caught by a movement down at the stream. He stopped and looked again and saw a doe and two fawns come out of the brush. The doe sniffed the air, swiveled her big ears, curious. She was looking upstream. He carefully laid down the axe and picked up the rifle, got the doe in his sights. She was not 50 yards away. He fired and killed her with one clean shot. The fawns whirled, lunged into the brush, and he took his knife and hurried down the slope to bleed the doe, smiling to himself. He had been hungry for red meat, for venison. Here it was, practically in the frying pan. He bled the doe clean, then butchered out one loin and took it back to his camp, exulting. He chopped dry wood from the dead pine, built up his fire, cut a slice of venison, and set it to cook. He hung his blanket where it would catch some of the fire's heat, hoping to dry it out before he tried to sleep in it. The venison cooked with a tantalizing odor. It had been a long time since he'd eaten venison. Finally, it was done enough. He put it on his tin plate, cut another slice, and set it to cook, and began to eat. The first few mouthfuls tasted wonderful, but then the taste began to change. He didn't know why. He put more salt on it, and that helped. He finished the first slice, and the second slice was ready, but he left it in the firing pan. Something was bothering him. He was angry at himself for being bothered. Finally, he exclaimed aloud, "I didn't sing the deer chant either." He said it defiantly, then was silent, abashed and somehow sorry he had said it. He took the second slice on his plate and cut into it. It was too done, but he ate it, telling himself at least he wasn't wasting cooked meat. When he had finished, he looked at the rest of the loin and decided to cook enough of it to last him the trip out. It wouldn't spoil if it was cooked, not so quickly anyway. So he fed the fire and cooked several panfuls of slices and wrapped them and stowed them with his other supplies. By then the drizzle had stopped and the few stars were out in an open patch of sky off to the north. His blanket was still damp, but he rolled up in it and went to sleep, knowing he was going to get out of here in the morning. He had a restless night, and he had dreams, mostly about his mother and the old tales, that he refused to remember the next morning. He got up shivering in the chilly dawn, cooked a breakfast of pancakes and the last of his bacon, closed his pack, and was ready to go. He looked at the venison hanging from the tree, more than half the loin he had taken from the doe, and he took it down and left it on the ground, where the carrion eaters would soon dispose of it. Then he went along the hillside half a mile before he turned and followed the easy trail beside the creek, not even allowing himself to look at the doe's carcass. The brush was dripping, but the air was clear and crisp, as always after a rain. A few degrees lower it would have been frosty. He thought of frosty mornings at the lodge his father had built, when his mother sang at her work and taught him little songs about the yellow leaves and the hoarding squirrels and the fawns that had lost their spots. Some of the words came back to him now. He could smile at them, remembering, because he was going away from here and probably would never come back. Then he came to a place where he could look off the southeast and see Horse Mountain, shimmering in the clear morning air as his mind went back to the frosty morning when he went down the valley from Bald Mountain to the charred ruins of the lodge and met Betty Grayback and the old man called Fish, waiting there at the foot of Horse Mountain to take him back to school. That was a bitter memory. He put it away from him. He went down the creek back again, pushing that memory from him, and he came to a place where the creek made a small mud flat. He went around it and started on and turned back. His eyes had seen nothing that his mind had missed. He went back and looked again. It was a bear track there in the mud flat. It was full of water from the rain, but it was a big track. He saw other tracks, all of them full of water. They had been made during the rain yesterday. He looked around across the creek in a soggy saw of a game trail. He found another track, a track clean enough to show the long triangular sole mark, the round prints of the 5 toes, even the claw marks, all 5 of them. No, only 4 claw marks. It was the mark of a hindfoot identical with the print he'd seen on Horse Mountain. He went up on the slope, finding a sign here and there. On a quarter of a mile, he found a stump that had been ripped apart, and beside it was the mark of a forepaw, the rough half-moon of the palm, the rough heel print, the round toe marks, and the claw prints. There was no doubt now this bear was not a cinnamon. No cinnamon bear ever had such paws or such claws. The trail wandered, zigzagging back up the mountainside, down through the gullies, doubling back on itself. It wasn't more than 36 hours old. He forgot time until it was mid-afternoon and he was hungry, and the pack straps were cutting into his shoulders. He went to a nearby rise and took his bearings. Off to the southeast was Horse Mountain. To the northeast was Bald Mountain. He was on the first bench of Granite Peak, and the only sensible thing to do was to find a campsite, spend the night, leave his pack, and pick up the trail again in the morning. Then stay with it till he ran the bear down. He worked his way along the bench till he came to a place where a small creek bubbled across an opening with a thicket of lodgepole pines in the back and a clear view to the east. The kind of campsite he should have chosen in the first place instead of squatting down at West Fork in the rain. He picked a spot close beside the creek and sheltered by the pines. He cut poles and slung his tarp for a roof, quickly laid up stones for a fireplace, and gathered wood and built a fire. He set coffee to cook, opened the packet of cooked venison, and put a slice in the frying pan to warm up. It didn't taste the way it had tasted fresh, but it was meat, food. He ate while his blanket, still damp, steamed in front of the fire. They smoothed the place for a bed, rolled up and slept, dog-tired. The sun wakened him the next morning. He made a quick breakfast, stowed the remaining venison in a small pack, put everything else except his knife and a rifle under the tarp, and went back to where he had left the trail yesterday. It was a cold trail, and for the first hour he wondered if he could follow it at all. Then his eyes began to sharpen. He saw little signs that he had missed the day before. A broken bush here, a scuffed patch of gravel there. By afternoon he was able to lay out a line to follow, for the bear had stopped wandering at random, was going somewhere. He forced himself to stop thinking like a man and began to think the way a bear would think. He hadn't made the big kill since he had been on the trail. It was getting hungry for something more than grubs and quamash and chipmunks. It would go down the valley and kill a deer. Go to where the deer were anyway. He laid out a line and followed it, and he knew he was right. Going down the long slope, he came to a pine tree with a low branch where the bear had stopped and scratched his back. A few white-tip hairs were still caught in the rough bark. He would have missed that sign yesterday, but now he saw it. A little later, he found a small aspen that had been bent down and walked on and scratched its belly, breaking the brittle branches along one side. Then it was dusk. He made a cold camp, ate some of the meat. He didn't like the taste or the smell of it, but he ate. They found a clump of low-hung spruce and crawled in among them and spent the night. The next morning he ate more of the meat and went on. The trail led down the valley to Los Pinos Creek. Following the bear trail up the creek, he began to have stomach cramps. When his head felt light, he began to sweat. He had to stop and rest, and when he started up again, the cramps were worse. He had retched and vomited twice, cleaning out his stomach, and felt better. But before he went on, he opened the packet of meat. It had begun to stink. He retched at the smell, and he threw the meat away. Then he found a serviceberry bush and chewed a few twigs. The taste cleared out his mouth enough, and he cleaned his nose, and he could go on. Half a mile upstream, he found a mud wallow the bear had used the day before. From there, the trail left the stream, and that alone left him in the lower reaches of Bald Mountain. He thought he lost it there, but just before dark, he found a big pine where the bear had torn off strips of the outer bark to get the sweetest cambium layer beneath. The tooth marks are still clear, and the scar oozed fresh resiny sap. He made another cold camp that night, going without food. The next morning, the trail led him into Bald Mountain's first bench. There, just before midday, he found where the bear had waited beside a deer run. It made no kill, but was hungry for red meat. Nearby, he found where it had slept and where he found fresh scat it had made that morning. He knew he was getting close. Early afternoon, he found where he had made the kill. It had hidden in brush beside a deer run until 4 deer came along. A big doe, a smaller doe, and 2 late spring fawns. They came to where the bear was waiting, and the bear made its rush and struck down the big doe. The whole story is written unmistakably in frantic hoofprints, broken brush, a gout of blood still drying in the dust, and spatters of blood and loose deer hair and leaves and brush where the bear had dragged his kill up the mountainside. He followed the trail, wary now, every sense alert. It was only a few hours old. Less than 100 yards up the mountainside, he came to an opening among the trees and saw the cache. The bear had eaten its fill, then cruelly hid the rest of the carcass under a heap of scratched-up dirt and leaves. Cautiously, he made his way around the edge of the clearing, feeling every step, making no sound. The bear was sleeping not far away, gorged. When it had slept off its first big meal, he would return and eat again. Halfway around the clearing was a tumbled heap of huge boulders that had lodged there in some ancient slide. Moving like a shadow, he searched among them, making sure the bear wasn't there. They chose a hiding place among the rocks and settled down to wait. The cache was in clear sight, not 30 yards from the rocks. His rifle would be deadly at that range. So Tom has found where the bear made its last kill, and it will come back to make another meal. And so he's basically camped out there and waiting for this bear to return. Now we're in chapter 48, page 205. At first the sun felt comfortably warm, but as the rocks caught and reflected the heat, he began to feel scorched. His head began to ache and his eyes to burn, and his mouth felt parched. Thirst became a torture. He kept thinking of a small creek that had passed just before he had found that place where the bear had made its kill. He should have drunk his fill then, but he didn't. He was hungry too, but his belly didn't demand food. He hadn't eaten since the previous morning when his stomach had refused to keep the bad meat. But he had chewed twigs and a few dry berries, sucking but not swallowing them. He could fast, but thirst was a torture. He put a few pebbles in his mouth to suck on, but that was little help. Then he began to feel the cramping in his muscles, the tension of lying in one position. He tried to stretch his legs and made a noise among the dry twigs that had lodged among the rocks, and lay still again, enduring the aches. The afternoon slowly passed. Nothing came to the cache but a few magpies. They ate and squawked and flew away. Then the shadows crept across the opening. The sun slid down behind the shoulder of the mountain, and the quick chill of the early autumn evening made itself felt. The rocks still held their midday heat, but as the first stars appeared, a cold breeze flowed down the mountainside like a chilly mist. He edged closer to the rocks to share their warmth. Night came, full darkness. He tried to remember where the moon stood in its cycle, whether it was too early or too late, and knew that he hadn't really seen the moon in a long time. Didn't even know when it came to the full. And he knew that was wrong, since a man should have a sense of time, a friendship with the moon, and the stars and the earth. He looked up and he saw familiar stars. At least he hadn't forgotten the stars he once knew. He watched, staring at the dark, shadowy mound of the cache. Nothing was there, nothing that moved. Staring at it, his eyes wearied, he lost their focus. He looked at the trees, the clear line between the earth and sky, at the stars beyond, forcing his eyes to see. The chill made him shiver, and he hugged the rocks, and the warmth soothed him. He was very tired. He dozed, jerked himself awake, and fought the drowsiness. He tried to shift his position and cracked the dried twigs and lay still again. He drifted into sleep. He didn't know how long he slept, but when he awakened and stared down at the cage, he could still see it clearly. Now there were shadows in the clearing, dim shadows. Next he saw the moon, a starved, irregular half-moon. Reaching back, he knew that such a moon didn't rise until around midnight. Now it was at least an hour high, so it must be 1 o'clock or soon after. He looked at the cache again. It was undisturbed. The bear hadn't been there. He looked around the clearing, shifting his focus to ease his eyes. He waited, eyes open and senses alert, but nothing came, and he drifted into weary half-sleep again. He thought he saw something move, but he knew it was an illusion. Only the moon's shadows were there, moving inch by inch as the moon climbed the sky. But then something was there, just beyond him in the moonlight. He tensed, gripped his rifle, and he knew it was not the bear, but it was a woman. He couldn't quite make out her face, though he forced his eyes open to look. He still couldn't see her features. But he knew, something deep inside him knew who she was. She was the mother. Not his own mother, but the all-mother. The mothers and the grandmothers, and all the way back to the beginning. And she was chanting, and her voice was both sad and pleading. Before he knew, he was chanting with her. But time after time he forgot the words of the chant before he came to the meaningful parts. He was singing softly as she sang. At last he knew he was singing the bear chant. He closed his eyes and he chanted, his voice now remembering all the words. And when he had finished the chant, he opened his eyes and she was gone. Only the moon was there directly overhead, and his voice went on singing as though apart from him. Then he saw the bear. It came out of the shadows among the trees, and it slowly crossed the opening a few steps at a time, pausing to look and listen and to nose the air. It was frosty in the moonlight. It was high in the shoulders, and its face was dished, not long and straight like a cinnamon bear's face. It came slowly towards the cache and stopped and stared at the rocks where he was hidden. It lifted its massive head and smelled the air and uttered a throaty growl and shifted his forefeet, lifting one then the other. He paused in his humming song, and the bear's ears stiffened, alert. It rumbled a deep growl again and took 2 steps towards the rocks. He sang the low humming song again, came to the meaningful part and sang it. The bear stopped and waited. Still humming the bear chant, he carefully raised the rifle, rested it against the rocks. His eyes tried to sight it, but the light was dim. Wait, he told himself, wait for more light. And still humming the chant, he waited, and the bear turned away and went to the cache. It tossed leaves and dirt aside with sweeps and powerful paws and dragged the carcass into the open, and it began to eat. He watched, and his humming slowly died away, but the beat was still in him, like his own pulse. The bear paused in its eating from time to time and looked at the rocks, now accepting his silence as part of the night. His pulse drummed the beat of the chant, and time passed. First light of dawn dimmed the stars overhead. The moon began to fade, and at last he knew he could see the rifle sight clearly. was time to kill. He pressed his cheek to the rifle stock, aimed low in the shoulder where the heart lay close to the ribs. He tried to close the trigger and squeeze the trigger, but his fingers refused. He closed his eyes, fighting with himself. I came to kill the bear. His throbbing pulse asked, why? He answered, I must. Again his pulse beat. Why? He answered, to be myself. And the pulse asked, who are you? He had no answer. The pulse kept beating the question at him. Angrily he said, this bear has made trouble. The question beat back. To whom? His own bitter answer, to me. And the question as before, who are you? And he, having no answer that he could face, and whispering the words aloud, this bear did not make trouble. The trouble is in me. And he lowered the rifle. It was almost sunrise. The bear nosed the carcass, looked at the rocks, sniffed the air, lifted its lip and sniffed again. Then it turned and crossed the clearing to the trees where it had come in the moonlight. He watched it go, and when it was gone, he asked himself if he had seen a bear at all. Then he saw the open cache, the white bones of the carcass gleaming in the first sunlight. But as he looked at the rocks and trees and sky and earth, he felt like a stranger here. He waited, expecting feeling the past, but when he touched the rocks with his hand, they were cold and unfriendly. When he moved his cramped legs, the dry twigs made a harsh, rasping sound. When he got to his feet, a jay screamed at him and he said it did not belong here. He rubbed life into his numb legs, left his hiding place and went down the slope of the game trail. The bushes resented him. He went to the creek and the rocks brushed his knees as he knelt to drink. The water was refreshing until he stood up again. Then it made him feel sick and weak. Weak from hunger, he told himself. He needed food. He would go back to the carcass and find scraps the bear had left, but his stomach nodded at the thoughts of meat that had lain in the sun all yesterday. I will kill my own meat, he said aloud. He sat and watched the deer run for a time, but nothing came. He got to his feet, started down the mountainside, hunting, and heard the noise of his stumbling footsteps, but was unable to silence them. He saw nothing to kill, found nothing to eat, not even dried berries he could suck on for their scant juice. Even the twigs he plucked and chewed were bitter in his mouth. He went down the slope and across the valley, stumbling like a drunken man, knowing only that he must return to his own camp. He came to a creek and drank and rested among the unfriendly trees. Then it was afternoon and he went on, knowing he was a stranger, but knowing, too, he must keep going. Dusk came. Darkness deepened and the stars appeared. He tried to find a star that he could guide by, and the stars wavered in the sky. He waited for them to settle into place again. He heard the All-Mother singing the star chant, the chant to the night. He began to sing the chant with her, and after a while the stars were clear again and steady in their places. He chose one to guide by, and he went on, chanting the night chant. And at last he was going up the long slope of Granite Peak, climbing through the brush and among the aspens and the pines that were silent, that said silent he was a stranger there. But he was still singing the star chant. Though his voice was only a hoarse whisper, and the stars stayed in their places. It was almost morning when he came to his camp. He saw the sheltering tarp in the thin moonlight, and he heard the sound of the creek. He drank and he opened his pack and laid down and wrapped his blanket around him. He rested, dozing, only half sleeping, when the flush of dawn lightened the sky. He sat up, knowing what he must do. He put his blanket aside, stripped himself naked, and went to a place where the creek made a pool among the rocks. He stepped in the pool, and the cold black water drove fiery needles into his legs. He scooped handfuls of water and splashed it into his belly and chest, then sat down in the knee-deep pool. The cold was like knives at his testicles and knotted his whole belly, and the current piled against his shoulders, and the pain sliced his very vitals. Then the pain began to ease as he scrubbed himself with handfuls of sand from the pool's bottom. He bathed, and as the sun was about to rise, he got out and rubbed life back into his legs. They sat on the rock facing the east. As the sun rose, he chanted the song to a new day, chanting to the sun and the earth and everything in between. Then, naked and armed, he started up the mountain. All morning he made his way through the brush and timber, over the rocks and ledges and gravelly slopes. Noon came and he stopped to rest. He looked at the sun and thought how round it was, how round is the path it follows. He looked at the sky, the blue roundness of the sky, and he looked at the roundness of the aspen trunks. He closed his eyes and sang a silent chant to the roundness of all things, this great roundness of life. When he finished, he lay on his belly close to the earth and let the sun beat on his back. He lay there a long time, the earth and the sun holding him between them. Then he went on. The last part was a difficult climb. It was late afternoon when he reached the top. already deep dusk in the valleys. He stood there and watched the sun sink behind a cloud on the horizon and sent flaming colors that raced across the sky, gold, then pink, then purple. He watched, but he could sing no song and sang no chant. He had come to listen, not to talk. When the colors had gone, the first stars appeared. He went down the mountainside till he came to a clump of wind-warped junipers and a mat of prickly needles beneath them. He crawled in and lay down, weak with fasting and fatigue. His muscles ached, his joints throbbed, and the night's chill bit his flesh. The prickles in his bed built into his skin like tiny coals of fire, but he slept. Dreams came. First came unwanted dreams. He was in the corral at the agency and was riding a huge frosty bear. It lunged from the chute, and he lashed it with a rawhide quirt and raked it with his spurs. It lunged 3 times, side-jumped and spun, but now it was no longer a bear, but a bronc. The big roan bronc had fell as he was trapped in the saddle. But as he crawled free and stood up, there was Red Dillon saying, "You double-cross me and I'll break your goddamn neck." He struck Red Dillon with his fist and knocked him down. But Red Dillon was not there. A horse was struggling on the ground, a big black bronc. It lifted his head, snorting bloody foam, and it said, "A los muertos." And his head fell back with a thud and a sigh, and it was dead. He wakened, so tense his muscles screamed with pain. Then he felt the cold and the fiery bite of the needles, and he drew his knees up to his chest to feel his own warmth. He slept again. He dreamed he was a boy, lost and crying his loneliness beside the cold char of the lodge. Then the ruins of the lodge were gone. He was sitting in the night watching the flames of the barn tower towards the stars, and the stink of smoldering hay was in his nostrils. Then it was in his mouth, the taste of hospital coffee, and Mary Redmond was saying, "Put away your tomahawk and take the feathers out of your hair." And he stared at the white ceiling, which turned to a cloud of fine white ash, then to a cloud of stars, and he was awake again. Awake and staring at the starry night sky through the juniper branches. Once more he slept and dreamed he was alone, walking over the earth in the night. He came to a mountain and he said, "I have forgotten who I am." And there was no answer. He said, "I was the boy who went with Blue Elk and did what I was told what he said I must do." Again, there was no answer. "I went with Red Dillon and did what he said I must do." Still there was no answer. "I killed as they taught me to kill," he cried. At last the mountain's voice said, "Why?" He was silent a long time. Then he said, "I had to kill the past. I had to be myself, and now there was nothing left to kill except myself, for I did not kill the bear." Then the 4 colors, black and blue and yellow and white, were all around him, and the wind screamed and the lightning shook the earth. The colors became men, and they were made gestures to each other, to the 4 directions, and the earth beneath them and the sky above. They began to dance the bear dance. A deer came and joined them, a deer with a gaping wound and 1 loin missing. It tried to dance, but its entrails danced or dragged about its legs, and the bear came and wept for the door. Then everything was gone except the colors, and the 3 of them faded, leaving only the white. And the mountain asked, "Who are you?" He could not answer, but a voice answered for him. "He is my son." It is the voice of the All-Mother. Then he wakened, and the white was all around him, the white light of truth and understanding. He saw frost on all the juniper branches shining in the light of dawn. He lay there at first not knowing where he was, then remembering. He sat up and crept out from among the junipers, too stiff with the cold to stand on his feet, until he rubbed life into his legs with handfuls of frosty juniper needles. He washed himself with the frosty needles, and when the sun rose, he stared till his eyes were blinded, then sang the chant to the new day, singing softly to himself. Then he went back down the mountain. He went back to his camp, so weak from the fasting he had to stop and rest. He went to his camp and opened his pack of supplies, but he did not eat. Having no cornmeal, he had a handful of flour and went down the creek to a place where a deer might come to drink. He crouched beside the water and smoothed the patch of sand with his palm, then took a stick and drew a picture of a deer. He drew the picture and spoke to it, calling it by name, and he said he needed its help. He said he had killed his sister and wanted the parts because he had forgotten who he was. He said that a man's memory is a faltering thing, but he now had purified himself, and now he remembered. He scattered the flour over the pitcher, his offering to it. He sang the deer chant. He said, "I will be quick and merciful, brother deer, and I will use your parts as I should." And he went back to his camp. He slept till late afternoon, still fasting. Then he put on a breechclout, took the rifle and the knife, and returned to the place where he had drawn the picture in the sand. He chose a place in the brush and sat down and made himself a part of the bushes. And he sang no song. He thought no thoughts. A part of the bushes. he made himself a part of the earth in the evening, telling himself that he must be strong enough to see when the deer comes. Just before the light was too dim to see the rifle sights, they came, 2 does and a buck. They came quietly down to the water. The does drank, making little ripples in the water. The buck watched them, waiting. One doe lifted her head, and water dripped from her muzzle and made little circles that spread and slowly floated away. Then the buck turned broadside and waited. His rifle was resting on his knee, but his hands were quivering, his eyes bleared. He forced himself to steadiness, and the shot shook the earth. The rocks and the trees trembled, and the does were gone in one quick rush, but the buck stood for a long moment as though unhurt. It took one step, faltered, went to its knees, and fell with a long sigh of expended breath. Then there was silence. He crossed the stream, and his knife glinted in the thinning light. The buck's blood spilled from the slit throat. He whispered, "Earth, drink this blood that now belongs to you." He waited till the flow had stopped, then knelt and slipped the skin down the buck's breast between its legs and began to lay it back from this warm red meat. He butchered it the old way and carried every part back to camp. Then he broke his fast. He cooked and ate and slept. Now the last chapter, chapter 49, page 212. He built the lodge there on the first bench of Granite Peak, but before he cut the pole for the lodge, he set up a drying rack, sliced the venison into thin strips, and hung it to cure in the smoke and slow heat of the smudge fire. He fleshed the hide and started the tanning with a mixture of liver and brains. He put aside sinews for sewing, saved antlers and bones from which to make awls and scrapers and other tools, boiled out and saved marrow fat, and used every usable part of the buck, as he had promised. Then he cut poles in the pine thicket, choosing them carefully to leave no obvious gaps. He built the lodge and banked it with the brush and earth and leaves to make it winter warm and mask its newness, to make it a part of the mountainside. When he had finished the lodge, he took another deer, cured more meat for the winter. He made rawhide from a part of that skin, for moccasin soles and snowshoe webbing, made leather from the rest of it for the winter moccasins and leggings. He caught trout and smoked them. He gathered sweet acorns and pinon nuts. He had a patch of wild white peas and gathered their seeds. He dug and dried the roots of elk thistle. He cut and trimmed ironwood and bent and shaped it to dry in season for snowshoe frames. And he stowed firewood in the lodge. Hard frost came and passed. Aspen leaves fell and lay crisp and briefly yellow in the valleys, and the dark flame of the scrub oaks faded to the brown of their bitter little scorns. The sky was clear and clean, and the air was crisp. The season turned to that pause where the mountains rest between summer and winter, and a man knows, if there's any understanding in him, the truth of his own being. Now he had time for the lesser task. He cut the leather for winter moccasins and shaped their rawhide soles. He made bow and awls and chose sinew for the sewing. And one afternoon, sitting in the sun, sewing in the sole of a moccasin, he thought again of the bear. He had gone to the hunt a dozen times, remembering each detail. He wondered what would have happened if he had squeezed the trigger. He might have made the kill, but if his eyes had blurred, if his hands had wavered the slightest trace, both he and the bear would now be dead. He had little doubt of that. If he had missed the heart with the first shot, the bear, numbed to further pain, would have taken a whole magazine of bullets and kept coming, an infuriated devil. It would have caught him among the rocks and killed him even as it was dying. He'd gone over that a dozen times, what happened and what might have happened. Now, sitting in the sun with the peace of the world around him, he began examining why he was driven to the hunt in the first place and why he acted as he did. He sat back and shifted the coil of dry sinew in his mouth, softening it with the saliva for sewing. He felt it was his tongue, drew out an end and tested it with his fingers. It was still too stiff and wiry. He picked up the rawhide sole and went on making carefully threaded holes with the bone awl. Searching for the whys, he reached back to beginnings, to the cub, to blue elk, to the school, to the quirting and the denial in the moonlight. That was where the hunt began, way back there. Not the actual bear hunt, but the hunt that led him to the bear years later. That was when he began hunting down all the painful things of the past to kill them. And one by one over the years he did kill them, all except the bear. All except his childhood, his own heritage. He could even list them now. Blue elk, Betty Grayback, Neil Swanson, Rowena Ellis, Red Dillon, Mayo. He paused, considering Mayo, then nodded, knowing he killed Mayo too when he burned the cabin. He could see Mayo's garden patch, weedy but still with the mark of Mayo's hand upon it, withering in the searing heat. Now, he didn't shoot or knife or choke any of them to death. There were other ways to kill. He killed them, the memory of them, in the arena when he became Killer Tom Black. He killed them all except the bear, and then he came back to the mountains, having looked death in the face himself. He came back to heal his body, to ride again, to go on trying to kill the one thing that he hadn't been able to kill, the bear, his own boyhood. And he met the bear and tried to go away again and had to come back and hunt it down. He straightened up to ease his shoulders and looked across the valley towards Horse Mountain, 15 miles away but looking less than half that in the clean, clear air. He thought of the day the bear came down and killed the lamb, the way he ran after it unarmed and told it to go away as he had long ago. Then he tried the sinews again and found it pliable. He drew out the end and began to sew the rawhide sole to the soft leather of the upper. He tried to go away after that, thinking he could forget the bear. He had to come back, knowing he couldn't forget, thinking he could hunt it down and make an end to the matter with a bullet, and leave the bear to rot and maggot away, only to find, when the moment came that he had done his killing so many things, so many memories, there was nothing left to kill except himself. Facing that and not knowing who he was, forgetting even his own identity, he didn't kill the bear. He went in search of himself. He sewed to the end of the sinew and drew another strand from his mouth, remembering the penance trip upon the mountain. The memory of that trip itself was vague because he was so weak from fasting that he had to do by instinct, by willpower, knowing he must go or die in the effort. Knowing this was the answer to the ultimate hunt. Not the bear hunt, but the penance journey up the mountain. The memory was vague, but the dreams, the visions were still clear. He accomplished on that trip up the mountain what he set out to accomplish, unknowing, on the bear hunt. He had killed himself, the self he had been for so long. He killed Tom Black, the vengeful demon who rode horses to death. He set out to kill a boyhood when he turned back at Piedra Town that morning, and he succeeded at last in killing a man and in finding himself. He sighed, knowing why he had come back. He remembered a chipmunk he had as a small boy, a pet that came when he was called and sat in his hand. He had asked his mother the meaning of the stripes on the chipmunk's back. Those stripes, she said, were the pass from its eyes, which would seize now and tomorrow, to its tail, which is always behind it and a part of yesterday. He had laughed at that and said he wished he too had a tail. His mother had said, "When you're a man, you will have a tail, though you'll never see it. You'll always have something always behind you." He shifted the moccasin between his knees and auled more thread holes in a tough sole that went on sewing. It had been a long journey, he thought, the long and lonely journey a man must make when he is lost and searching for himself, particularly one who denies his own past and refuses to face his own identity. There was no question now of who he was. The All-Mother's words in the vision stated it beyond denial: "He is my son." He was a Ute, an Indian, a man of his own beginnings, and nothing would ever change that. He had tried to change it following Blue Elk's way, and he had tried following Red Dillon's way. He had tried in following the ways of Tom Black. He still had to wade back to himself, to learn that none of those ways could erase the simple truth of the chipmunk stripes, the ties that bind a man to the truth of his own being, his own part of the enduring roundness. He finished the moccasin and examined it, satisfied with his workmanship. His hands remembered, and his mind had begun to remember and accept. The moccasin, like the lodge, was a part of the acceptance. He was not a Cloud Indian, never would be again. But for a time he had to go back to the old ways, make his peace with his world and with himself. He had begun to feel that peace at last. In time he would go back to Bagosa to talk with Jim Thatcher if he was still alive, learn what happened to Blue Elk, try to understand why he sold his people the way he did. And he would go to the reservation eventually, to the school, and see what was happening there now, and try to understand that too. But never again would he go back to the arena. He had ridden his broncs, fought and killed the hatreds and his hurts. He was no longer Tom Black. He was Tom Black Bull, a man who knew and was proud of his own inheritance, who had come to the end of his long hunt. He went into the lodge, put the moccasin carefully away with its mate, put the owl in his case, and laid away the coil of sinew. He stirred the pot of stew and thrust a fresh stick of wood in the coals. Then he went back out in the evening up the slope a little way to a big rock where he could see Horse Mountain and Bald Mountain and the whole tumbled range of mountains. He sat there and watched the shadowed darkness in the valleys. Where the sun had set, he whispered the chant of the evening. It was an old chant, a very old one, and he sang it not to the evening, but to himself, to be sure he had not forgotten the words, to be sure he would never again forget. And that is When the Legends Die. Thanks, folks.